All right, welcome back, U.S. History. Man, I've got some exciting news. This is the last lesson of the Civil War unit, which means it's your last lesson of the entire year. So control yourselves. I know you're going to be happy about that. Unfortunately, we can't do this in person. We can't wish you well and send you off to high school. But you know that we're all very proud of you, and we're glad and of all the hard work you've done during this virtual learning time, and we're excited for what the future holds for you. All right, but that being said, I got to teach the last lesson. So give me your attention for the next 25, 30 minutes. This one's a little bit long. Not trying to go out boring you to death, but got a lot to talk about. All right, this picture you see here, it's pretty brutal. This is going to be a subject that we discuss in this unit, talking about turmoil back at home. This is not a battlefield. This is not Civil War soldiers here between the North and the South. These are common citizens in cities who are rioting. We're going to talk about one specific riot today and how basically people are taking out their frustrations over the Civil War on each other. All right, one nickname for this war is rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Essentially, if you were a wealthy slave owner, if you were a wealthy industrialist, if you had really money of any kind, you could find your way out of the war, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The majority of the men who are going to be fighting in this war are going to be very poor. Your poor average farmer coming off your fields in the South, and your poor average industrial worker coming out of the factory in the North. These are the men who are going to be bleeding and dying on the battlefield. Okay, in 1863, the North and the South both find themselves in a little bit of a predicament. They're running out of men. See, back when the war started, there was a lot of eager people willing to enlist, join up for the cause. By 1863, that is definitely dropped. You don't see men as willing to enlist and volunteer to join the war effort. North and the South are going to have to find a different way to fill their armies, especially after the Battle of Gettysburg, where lots and lots of men are killed on both sides. It becomes evident we're going to have to take some drastic measures. So what they do is they enact something called conscription, or what we would call a draft, which is essentially forcing people to serve in the military. I'll describe the South first. In the South, this is men between the ages of 18 to 45 are eligible in the draft. Essentially, all men are going to be eligible. It doesn't mean every single man is going to be drafted, but pretty much if you're of that age, there's a good chance you're going to find yourself being forced to serve in the Army. If you were wealthy, though, you could get out of this. A wealthy person could hire a substitute. Basically, you pay a fee and you send somebody else to fight in your place. It could start at 300, but it could go much larger, really depending on how badly you wanted to get out of the war. If you were a wealthy plantation owner who owned more than 20 slaves, you were also exempt. Obviously, it was seen as more important that you stay home and manage your plantation and your slaves, grow your cotton and other valuable crops that the South hoped to trade with primarily to Europe. So there's a good reason, or that's the reason essentially planters were staying home, so they could oversee the production of cash crops, and because they needed to sell those cash crops specifically to European countries, specifically cotton. That's why they got to stay home. All right, in the North is offering bounties or cash payments to volunteers. It's like, don't wait for the draft, because if you get drafted, we're not going to give you this money, and you're still going to have to serve in the Army anyway. But if you come on your own and you volunteer, we're going to give you an upfront one-time cash payment or a bounty. But if you don't and you're drafted, then you don't get any money. So this really enticed a lot of men to join up, to volunteer, because they did want that money, and it was a lot of money in some cases. It varied depending on city to city, state to state, but it could be months worth of pay, and for a poor person and their family, that's a big deal. So that money was very attractive. Only a small percentage of men are going to be drafted because of the bounty system. A wealthy man in the North could still hire a substitute, could still basically pay his way out of the war if he chose to do that. What you see here is an example of a draft wheel. This wheel would be taken into a city or a county. All the eligible men would have their name written down on a piece of paper, shoved into that wheel, give the wheel a spin. Somebody would reach in and start pulling out names. And if they bolt out your name, then essentially, hey, welcome to the U.S. Army. You've just been drafted. Very exciting, I'm sure. Not everybody was appreciative of this. We're going to talk about one specific time in American history where a whole city really erupted in riots. This is July of 1863. This is in New York City. This is a riot directly related to the draft in New York City. The city, many people in the city are going to end up looting, burning, destroying large sections of the city. African Americans are going to be targeted. And it does make sense why they were. It certainly doesn't justify the violence against them. But a lot of the poorer classes in New York, specifically the Irish, were not happy that they were being drafted into an army to fight for freedom and rights for African Americans. See, African Americans in New York City were at the lowest part of what we'd call the socioeconomic ladder. Just above them were the Irish. The Irish did not want to lose their social position to African Americans. They did not want the war to end and then see hundreds of thousands, potentially, of African Americans coming up from the South to cities like New York, competing for their jobs. They wanted to stay above them socially. They wanted to keep them below. They did not want to fight for their rights and freedoms. So they were very upset with the draft. And they took out their frustrations in this riot, and specifically took out their frustrations on African Americans in New York City. They killed many on the streets, beat them, lynched them, horrific ways and horrific violence against African Americans. This riot is really only going to be put down when Union soldiers are called directly from the battlefield at Gettysburg. They're going to be sent directly from Gettysburg to New York City to calm things down and to end this riot. So if you can imagine United States forces or soldiers marching through the streets, firing at civilians to try to stop a riot. It's hard to imagine that today. All right, I've got lots of great videos, but I got to be a little bit more choosy about what I play for you guys, or else this little lesson is going to go forever. This first one is about the New York City draft riot. I think it's one of the better ones, so that's why I'm playing this one.
In early 1863, Commander-in-Chief Lincoln and his Union generals faced a huge problem: running out of troops. It's difficult for me to get my head around the number of dead and wounded on both sides. Short on volunteers, Congress instituted a military draft. July 11, 1863, just days after Gettysburg, draft wheels like this one rolled into the most crowded Union city, home to more immigrants than any other, New York. While the rich could pay a fine to avoid service, many poor had to enlist.
For the working class community of New York City, especially the Irish, they felt that it fell on them in a disproportionate or unfair way.
From the bottom rung of white society, Irish immigrants, the poorest New Yorkers, had a long and violent history with the only group below them, African Americans. Fears that newly freed blacks would pour into the city and take jobs from whites reached a boiling point. For New York's large Irish population, the draft turned friction into fire.
The fear was that many people saw that draft as, oh, you are now forcing us to fight for the freedom of black Americans. And in New York City, a riot breaks out.
The protesters quickly gained speed, first setting fire to the draft office, then lashing out at the wealthy and businesses that employed blacks. Within hours, the chaos reached the factory of piano maker William Steinway.
Monday, terrible excitement throughout the city.
Today, his diary provides a chilling account.
Resistance to the draft.
Rows of buildings on 3rd Avenue burning down.
When the mob arrived on their doorstep, Steinway's brother, Charles, paid them off.
Charles gave the ringleaders $20 to $40 in money and won a check for $30.
That was kind of a lot of money, wasn't it?
It was. I couldn't put it in terms of their pay per day, but it was a lot.
But money could not subdue the rage.
Soldiers with cannon marching down 3rd Avenue.
All business in the upper part of the city suspended. Negroes chased everywhere and killed when caught.
A lynch mob roamed the city. A black orphanage was burned to the ground. They murdered anyone, black or white, who tried to intervene.
It's an example of how tenuous the notion of what the Civil War really was about. For some, they still felt the entire war was only about bringing the Union together, not doing anything for African Americans.
Lincoln ordered federal troops, 4,000 straight from the horrors of Gettysburg, to quell the riots. Just as quickly as hysteria had engulfed the city, it was displaced by a chilling quiet. The final death toll, 120.
Pretty horrific event. We're also going to talk about some opposition, political opposition. First off, political opposition we're seeing this in the North. There are Northerners who actually sympathize with the South. They don't really want to continue this war. They would like a peace treaty. They would like, in a lot of Northerners' eyes, they're okay with letting the South go. Let them have their own country. We'll do our own thing. They'll do their own thing. Southern sympathizers with the South are called Copperheads, Northerners who wanted to make peace with the Confederacy. And obviously they're blaming Lincoln for forcing this war. You forced the South into this. Why didn't you just let them go? We're better off on our own. They're better off on their own. Now in the South, you're going to see opposition. You're going to see them from soldiers on the battlefield, desertion. Desertion is when a soldier just leaves his unit, runs away essentially. If caught, there can be severe consequences. You can be physically punished, and you could be executed. Also, Southern states are having a hard time with the Confederate government in Richmond. These Southern states, remember, the whole notion of freedom was about states' rights. About leaving the Union was for states' rights. And now they're being told what to do by a new government led by Jefferson Davis in Richmond. States like South Carolina and Georgia are not happy about that. They do not want to be told what they can and cannot do. They do not want to be told that they have to force their men to serve in the Army because of a draft. So states' rights makes it very awkward for many of the Southern states. They're not really wanting to respond to federal laws coming out of Richmond. All right, just two little posters here, two little pictures to describe some of what we've talked about. This bottom one, these men, snakes, obviously copperheads, that's what they're being portrayed as. These are the people in the North who sympathize with the South. You can see the Union. We have the female figure of Liberty. We've seen that before. Her shield says Union, and she has a sword. She's trying to fight back the Copperheads, trying to fight off their influence. And here we have Lincoln giving a bowl which reads emancipation to a slave, and on his forehead is slavery. So pretty obvious. Whatever's in the bowl is some kind of probably medicine or some kind of, you think of it like an elixir to help cure the ills of slavery, help the nation recover from the sickness of slavery, if you'd like to think of it that way. All right, during this time, Lincoln and Jefferson Davis both have to figure out how they're going to react to some of this political opposition. You know, when people speak out against the war in the North and the South, when people not just speak but take action, maybe trying to hurt the war effort in the North and the South, what are they going to do? Well, they both do this. They suspend something called habeas corpus, and you might remember habeas corpus from civics. Essentially, habeas corpus makes it illegal for the government to put somebody in jail and not give them a fair trial. So the government can't just put people in jail, throw away the key, and let them rot for years and years. They're supposed to give them a trial where they bring up evidence and they charge them, and everything is brought out into the light. Well, Lincoln and Davis both suspend habeas corpus. So now they can imprison people and not give them a fair trial and not charge them and let them sit there for basically as long as they want. So this is obviously very controversial. But they both feel it's necessary to limit opposition to the war, which they think is damaging to the war effort and damaging for their chance to win the war. Many people, especially those copperheads, see these acts as just outrageous. All right, the next unit, or the next section, excuse me, we're going to be talking about the economy. So I'm not going to read this paragraph to you. It's in your notes. The next slide is going to be basically summarizing the paragraph with all the important points that you'll be filling in with the notes. The economic effects in the South. We got food shortages, pretty obvious. Most of these farmers have left to go fight in the war. So Southern farms do not have people on them. Remember, the majority of people do not own slaves. The majority of people are farming for themselves. So when the men go off to fight, there's nobody there to tend the farms, and we're going to have food shortages in the Confederacy. which means that prices are going to shoot up. When you don't have a lot of goods, demand rises and prices go up with it. This is inflation. Very hard for families to survive. And you're going to see slaves also resisting. So the slaves who are working on the plantations are starting to fight back, resisting work, fleeing, running away, fleeing to Union lines. Some men joining the Union Army. This is obviously going to hurt production on the plantations. You can see there's a negative sign next to every single one of these things I read about the South. That's because it's a negative impact on the South. On the North, you're going to see some positives, some plus signs, and some negative signs to indicate both positive and negative economic results. One of the positives, the North has the factories, so production skyrockets. It increases drastically. They're making everything from blankets, tents, weapons. The list could go on and on. They're making everything the Army needs, so factory production just really increases greatly. You're also going to see inflation or prices rising in the North, but it's not as bad as the South. North also passes an income tax. You can see this as a positive and a negative. The income tax is a way to pay for the war, so the government likes that. It's a negative in that citizens don't really like paying the tax, but oh well, that's sort of what they have to do. The North needs the money to fight the war. Also, another positive is there's a common currency. The North finally creates one common currency for all the states. Everything will be equal, everything will be consistent, and this is going to help pay for the war as well. I also wanted to show you a video about another riot. I talked about a riot in the North. Let's now talk about a riot in the South. Richmond is the Confederate capital, and although the riot that occurs in Richmond is not as drastic, not as brutal as the one in New York City, it's still definitely interesting, and I think we should look at an example of each. So opposition in the South. This is not to the draft, though. This is called the Richmond Bread Riots. This is opposition to food shortages.
And back on the home front, Southern civilians were fighting their own battles for survival. Both armies ravaged crops, and the price of food skyrocketed. Many faced starvation. Most of great-great-granddaddy's letters mentioned food, specifically how little there was in camp or how bad the food was. Thank you. As the war dragged on, the price of bread skyrocketed beyond the reach of most civilians. A lot of the ladies here in Richmond and in other cities across the South organized bread riots in protest. On April 2nd, 1863, an angry crowd of about 300 women marched on Richmond's White House of the Confederacy.
They go up to the mansion where Jefferson Davis is staying, and they petition him. They say, you're fighting this war, but you are turning your back on the citizens of this country.
The mob then unleashed its frustration on shopkeepers.
They take out axes, they take out sticks, they break windows, they go in and they take those goods.
As the war goes on, especially in 1863, there's widespread evidence of dissent across the South. Their communities are starving. So you see all kinds of signs of the South unraveling.
Civilians were suffering, but soon the cruel tide of war would sweep across their very doorsteps.
All right, so just another example of opposition and people fighting back to the circumstances that they're experiencing on the home front. All right, the next part of this, we're going to start talking about the end of actual military fighting, the end of the military campaigns. We're going to leave the home front and go to the battlefield. All right, first thing we're going to start with is this guy. You got to know Ulysses S. Grant. He is the #1 Union general by this time. 1864, Lincoln gives General Grant command of pretty much all Union armies. And he is in charge of the Union armies personally, physically. He's in charge of the Union armies in the East. But he has the say-so, and he can make decisions for any Union army really out there anywhere in the whole war. Now, Grant's main strategy is he's going to take down Richmond. He wants to take the capital. How's he going to do this? Yes, he has more men, he has more supplies, but it's still not going to be easy. He's going to use a war strategy called siege, to besiege a city. You basically surround it as best you can, and you try to starve it out. In this case, he's not just surrounding the city. He's really trying to capture Lee's army. Once he captures Lee's army, he can take whatever he wants. Lee's army is protecting Richmond. So he lays siege to Lee's army, which is essentially laying siege to Richmond. This is going to cause a lot of casualties, a lot of dead, a lot of wounded, a lot of missing. Obviously, the North is also going to have men run away or desert as well. A lot of captured, but they got plenty of troops. The North has plenty of troops, so that's not a worry for them. But in the South, it's a big problem. They can't replace their casualties, but the North can. Oh, also just a quick little side note. Ulysses S. Grant gets the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. U.S. Ulysses S. Unconditional Surrender Grant. He was known for that. All right, one of his best buddies, William Sherman. He is going to be fighting down in Tennessee and Georgia at the same time. Sherman serves under Grant. He's his right-hand man. Grant trusts him completely. While he is fighting Robert E. Lee up in Virginia, his plan is to march completely through Georgia and destroy everything in his path, essentially. Lincoln needs some really good victories in 1864 to help him win re-election. If he doesn't have some positive battlefield results, there's a chance that the public in the North may turn on him. So he's really looking for help here. And Sherman is going to pull through. In the fall of 64, he's going to take Atlanta, and he's going to end up marching his army all the way from Atlanta to Savannah, what is called the March to the Sea, completely destroying everything in his way. This is called total war. Total war is, yes, you're fighting the army. Yes, you want to fight the army, Confederate army. You want to kill their soldiers, but you want to destroy everything that might be of value to them. Destroy all, take all the food. If you can't take it, destroy it. Take all the livestock. This is citizens as well. If you're going to be destroying the farms and homes of citizens, taking their food, taking their livestock, taking their grain, destroying everything. If you can't take it, burn it. Everything you possibly can do to make the war hard on the public and the army. Here's his quote. "We are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people, and must make young and old, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war. There's no mercy for anyone." He pulls up to a house, and a woman's, sitting there with 5 kids, and she says, "My husband's in the Confederate army. I'm all alone. We're starving. Please don't burn my house. Don't take what we have. Sorry, we're taking it. We're taking everything. The more I do this now, the quicker we'll end the war, and you can get your husband back." That's what he's basically saying. So he is seen as brutal in the South. They cannot stand Sherman for his tactics of total war. All right, so it's called the March to the Sea, going from Atlanta to Savannah. That is the March to the Sea. And on the way from Atlanta to Savannah, not only is he destroying everything, any kind of factory, railroad line, anything he can get his hands on, he is burning, looting, destroying. He gives his army, now don't get me wrong, there were strict orders not to harm citizens. They were not supposed to kill Southern citizens. They were not supposed to physically harm them. They were just supposed to take and destroy property. I'm sure there were examples of that rule being broken, but all in all, that was the rule of the day that Sherman had given. Here's some examples. After they burned Atlanta to the ground, they laid siege to Atlanta and burned Atlanta to the ground. When they marched to Savannah, the army is actually spread out 60 miles wide as they march from Atlanta to Savannah. So think of everything in the path of 60 miles being completely destroyed. Here's a map to show Atlanta and the march to Savannah. And you can see how the armies are split up from one arrow down to the next. It said it's about 60 miles spread. Utter destruction as this army marches. And they're going to continue this policy of total war after they take Savannah as well. They're going to march north into South Carolina and then into North Carolina. Citizens are just trying to get out of the way. Who has time to fight? You have no food, you have no home. How can you even fight back against this army? You're just trying to find a place to lay your head and put some food in your stomach. All right, election of 1864. Lincoln is really helped by Sherman's victories in the South for the election of 1864. Lincoln is obviously, the South is not participating. The Confederacy is not participating in this election. You can see that Lincoln wins in a huge landslide in the Electoral College. But if you look at the popular vote, it's actually pretty darn close. The guy he's running against is George B. McClellan. This guy was actually a Union general. He was the Union general back at the Battle of Antietam and for some other earlier battles. He worked for Lincoln. Now he's running against Lincoln as a Democrat. Remember, Lincoln is the Republican. Now, McClellan is basically running as a copperhead. He's going to try to find a way to peacefully end this war. And, if that means the South gets independence, he's ready to listen to that. He's willing to consider that. Well, Lincoln is not. Lincoln is not going to even consider negotiating for peace. He's going to win this war. And as you can see, Lincoln is going to win the large victory in the Electoral College, but pretty small in the popular vote. Some people do lose faith in McClellan. By this time in the war, it looks pretty clear that the Union is going to win. So why would you vote for a guy who wants to talk about peace when you're so close to victory? And he had a reputation as being a little bit of an ineffective military leader back from his days as a general. When Lincoln is elected, immediately he starts putting out the message to the South. Listen, I don't hate you. I don't want to curse you. I don't want to destroy you. I want to find a way to get us back together. I don't want you to be your own independent country, and I'm going to fight to keep you, but I don't want it to have to be that way. It's like when this war is over, I'm going to invite you back, and I'm going to treat you like a brother, like we never had an issue. This is his quote from his second inaugural address. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive together to bind up the nation's wounds. Like, let's fix this. No matter how bad things have gotten, we can fix this and we can repair this relationship. All right, I don't want to humiliate you. I don't want to destroy you. I want to bring you back as soon as possible into this union. Well, how does that happen? So with Sherman's march to the sea, and he ends up going up into South and North Carolina, puts a lot of pressure on the South, and we still have Grant laying siege around Richmond and Lee's army. He's losing a lot of men, yes, but he has a lot to lose. So how does this actually end? Well, the last major fighting is going to end here in early April. Grant is finally going to break through Confederate lines. His siege is finally going to work, and Lee has to evacuate, and Grant is going to march into Richmond. Now, he follows Lee. He's going to chase Lee down, and on April 9th, he's essentially going to find Lee and catch him at a small Virginia town called Appomattox Courthouse. He cuts off Lee's escape, and Lee has no choice at this point. His men are starving. They barely have any supplies. They've got nothing left. Most of his army has either been killed, captured, or deserted. He's got to finally just face facts. I can't fight anymore. So, in this early April time, all right, April 9th to be exact, Lee and Grant are going to meet in a house at Appomattox Courthouse. They're going to meet in the parlor, and they're going to negotiate an end to the war. Now, Grant is actually very humble about this. He is not boastful. He is not like, ha, Lee, I won. I'm going to just rub your face in it. He shows humility. He doesn't want to make Lee look bad. He doesn't want to make the South look bad. He doesn't want to create any anger and animosity. He wants to be humble. He doesn't want to humiliate the South. He knows that if he treats them negatively, they're going to want to fight back, and it's going to make it harder to really end the war. So he has an attitude of reconciliation. Come on back, we'll fix this. And he got that straight from Lincoln. This is what Lincoln wanted him to do as well. Here are some of the quotes. Grant tells Lee and his men, drop your weapons and leave. You can just go home. I'm not going to put you in prison. I'm not going to try to put you on trial. Just drop your weapons, go home. The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again. Like, I know we were enemies, but we're not anymore. Now we're going to be brothers again, and we need to repair this relationship. Grant and Lincoln both want to restore the Union quickly. All right, my last video, very quick video about the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse.
As the rows of gravestones widened, the Union narrowed in on the Confederates. The general had been away from home for 4 grueling years. He knew his army's days were numbered. In April 1865, Union troops had captured the Confederate capital and cornered Lee in rural Virginia.
Lee did not go to Appomattox to surrender. Lee was trying to escape Appomattox. And on the morning of April the 9th, he recognized that further resistance was absolutely futile.
The fate of Lee and his army was determined in the parlor of this ordinary house. Although he'd sworn he'd rather die 1,000 deaths than surrender, Lee arrived first.
While Lee waited, he was, of course, extremely extraordinarily anxious.
Ever the Southern gentleman, the general was immaculately dressed. 30 minutes later, Union General Grant appeared.
When Grant arrived, he looked a little disheveled, and many have taken that as a lack of soldierly respect, but it was just the opposite.
General?
Grant simply didn't want to keep his adversary waiting. As they took their seats, this unlikely pair knew it was the beginning of the end of the war. Lee chose the tall, caned armchair. Grant sat in the leather-backed rolling chair. In silence, the Union general rapidly wrote fewer than 200 words on a small, spool-turned table. With victory at his fingertips, Lincoln could have ordered Grant to demand retribution and humiliate surrendering Confederates. Instead, he offered honor, allowing them to keep their horses and return home free. Some of Grant's men recognized the historical importance of the event.
They wanted to take some souvenir of that great moment. One officer grabs a chair, another one grabs the table, another one grabs another chair. And McLean, who owns the house, is saying, "Bring back my furniture," and they're throwing money as they ride off. It's amazing to me that over the years, the various pieces come back together here at the Smithsonian Institution.
All right, so with his surrender, effectively the war is over. There's still going to be some other Southern forces to surrender a little bit later, but for all purposes, when Lee surrenders, the game is up. All right, cost of war. This is the last part of your notes. It's the deadliest war the United States has ever fought in. We got 360,000 Union casualties, 260,000 Confederate casualties. Remember, we also have a large portion of these Union casualties that were also African American, 37,000 African American casualties as well. In terms of today's money, it's astronomical. $96 billion is spent by the Union, $46 billion is spent by the Confederacy. You can see pretty much almost double was spent by the Union. And they had the factories, they had the production, so it sort of makes sense. Remember, in 1861, we have the passage of the income tax in the North. Lincoln wants to help pay for the war with that. First time taxes placed on the money people earn. In the South, you have inflation in both the North and the South, but much worse in the South. The Union blockades, remember, the southern coasts, shutting down trade with foreign countries. This is going to cause, a lack of goods, and the ones that are left, the prices are going to skyrocket. With the end of the war, the South has to start facing the reality of transitioning. Not that they're going to completely abandon agriculture, because they're not, but the South is also going to try to start switching to become, more of an industrial section of the country. So the South is going to now slowly start developing more industry, and America begins to focus on becoming plainly an industrial nation. Obviously, without free labor anymore, the South plantations, they just can't keep that same system running. They're going to have to make some changes. The South is completely devastated physically and economically, no doubt about that, because pretty much the whole war, other than Gettysburg, is fought in the South. I'll show you a couple quick slides. This one talks about the money that was spent in today's dollars. It also talks about inflation, shows you some prices difference here. Beef, $1 to $8 in 2 years. Butter from $3 to $15. Cornmeal, $6 to $100. Flour, $30 to $1,000 per barrel. So that's an example of inflation. This chart just shows you the combined casualties of the two armies compared to the other wars that the United States has fought in. So you can see the Civil War far outpaces, in terms of death, any other war the United States has participated in. World War II is the next one, and it's barely even half. So the United States is dramatically changed forever. We're back together as one, but things, life is never going to be the same as it was. It's going to be a new future moving forward. Guys, that is the end of the lesson. I guess I'm the last one to have a lesson with you. All I can say is We're sorry how this year ended. I wish it could have been different. I wish I could have told these stories in person and given you more facts and details and showed you more cool videos, but this is just the way it is. Good luck in high school, no matter where you're going, Nice, Bartram, or Creekside, any other high school that might be. We know that you guys are going to be successful in the future, and we're just, like I said, sorry that it had to end on this note, and that you didn't have the same 8th grade experience that everyone else has had, myself included. But don't worry about that. You're going to have much more to come, much more fun in the future. All right, guys, signing off. It's been fun. I hope you reach out to your individual teachers and tell them how much you appreciate all the hard work they've done this year. All right, Mr. Miller signing off. Last time. Bye, guys.